The day I learned I no longer owned my own home, I realized the worst kind of betrayal never comes from strangers. My name is Margaret Carter, and until a few months ago, I believed I had lived a life that most people would call blessed. I was 68 years old, widowed for nearly a decade, and I had spent almost 40 years in the same little blue house on Maple Ridge Drive outside Columbus, Ohio. Every flower in the front yard had been planted by my late husband, Daniel, and every scratch on the hardwood floor carried a memory of birthdays, Christmas mornings, and family dinners. That house wasn't just real estate. It was every chapter of my life. So when I pulled into my driveway that Tuesday afternoon after having lunch with an old friend, the last thing I expected was to see two unfamiliar SUVs parked in front of my garage. At first, I assumed someone had the wrong address. Then I noticed a man carrying a measuring tape across my front porch while another person was taking pictures of my windows. I stepped out of my car and asked as politely as I could what they were doing. The younger man smiled, almost apologetically, and said, "We're meeting the new owners to discuss renovation plans." I actually laughed because I thought he was joking. I told him there had to be some mistake since I was the owner. His smile disappeared, replaced by an awkward silence that still echoes in my mind. He glanced at the clipboard in his hands before quietly saying, "Ma'am, according to our paperwork, the property officially changed ownership 3 days ago." My heart felt strangely calm for a few seconds, almost as if my brain refused to understand the words. Then I reached into my purse, pulled out my house keys, and walked toward the front door. Before I could unlock it, another couple approached from the sidewalk carrying a folder and introducing themselves as the buyers. They weren't rude. In fact, they looked almost embarrassed. The woman explained they had closed on the property through a licensed agency and had already transferred the funds. I stared at her face, waiting for someone to laugh and tell me this was all an elaborate misunderstanding. Nobody did. I called my son, Ethan, immediately. His phone rang twice before going to voicemail. I called again. No answer. Then again. Still nothing. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped my phone onto the concrete walkway. The buyers exchanged nervous glances, and one of them quietly suggested I contact my attorney. Attorney? Why would I need an attorney for my own house? I finally reached into my mailbox hoping to distract myself for just a second, and inside was an official envelope addressed to me. I opened it right there on the porch where I had welcomed neighbors for decades. The letter confirmed what everyone else already seemed to know. Ownership of my home had been transferred. My name was no longer listed as the legal owner. Standing there with that letter in my trembling hands, surrounded by complete strangers discussing paint colors and remodeling ideas for the place where I had built my entire life, I realized something far more terrifying than losing a house. Someone I trusted had made this happen, and deep down, before I had a single piece of proof, I already knew exactly whose voice I was afraid would eventually answer my next phone call. I drove away before anyone could see the tears filling my eyes because I refused to break down in front of strangers standing on what had been my front lawn for almost 4 decades. I pulled into the parking lot of a small grocery store less than 2 miles away and sat there with the engine running, staring at the envelope in my lap. I read every page 3 times, hoping I had misunderstood some legal language, but the words stayed exactly the same. The property transfer had been recorded, the sale had been completed, and the funds had already been distributed. None of it made any sense because I had never agreed to sell my home. I reached for my phone again and called Ethan. This time he answered. His voice sounded distracted, almost cheerful. He said he was meeting with wedding vendors and asked if he could call me later. I told him I needed to see him immediately because someone was claiming my house had been sold. There was a pause that lasted just long enough for my heart to sink. Then he quietly said, "Mom, I was going to explain everything after the wedding." Those words hit me harder than anything else that had happened that day. I asked him what he meant, and he replied that it was not a good conversation to have over the phone. He insisted there was a reasonable explanation and asked me to trust him for just one more day. Trust him. Those words kept echoing in my mind after he hung up without answering a single direct question. I drove straight to my bank because I suddenly remembered something that had bothered me for weeks. A few months earlier, Ethan had convinced me to let him help organize my online banking after I complained about forgetting passwords. He told me everything was becoming digital and that he wanted to make life easier for me. At the time, it had sounded thoughtful. Inside the bank, I asked to speak with a manager. She recognized me immediately because I had been banking there for years. After verifying my identity, she reviewed my recent account activity with a serious expression. Several unusually large withdrawals had been made over the previous 6 weeks. Wire transfers. Certified checks. Transactions I had never authorized myself. She carefully explained that they had all been completed using credentials associated with my account. My savings, the money Daniel and I had spent decades building for retirement, had almost disappeared. I felt cold even though it was the middle of July. I asked whether someone else had been given access to my account. The manager looked at her computer again before gently reminding me that I had signed paperwork months earlier allowing a trusted family member limited financial access for assistance. I remembered the afternoon Ethan had placed those documents in front of me. He had smiled, joked that I was becoming too stubborn to accept help, and assured me it was only for emergencies. I had signed because he was my son. I had never imagined that helping him would one day leave me sitting in a bank office wondering how much of my own life I still owned. The manager suggested that I gather every document I had at home and speak with an attorney as soon as possible. I almost laughed at the irony because I no longer even knew whether I could walk through the front door of the place where those documents had always been kept. By the time I left the bank, the sun was beginning to sink, but I felt as though an entire lifetime had disappeared in a single afternoon. I still needed answers, and there was only one place I believed I might find them. Ethan and his fiancée, Lauren, had rented a townhouse about 20 minutes away. I drove there without calling because I knew if I warned him, he would find another excuse to avoid me. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed several delivery boxes stacked near the garage. Expensive furniture. Decorative lighting. A large wooden dining table still wrapped in protective blankets. It looked like the kind of home 2 people would build after years of careful saving, not a couple planning a wedding just a few weeks away. Ethan opened the door before I even knocked. The smile on his face disappeared the moment he saw me. For several seconds neither of us spoke. Then he quietly invited me inside. Lauren was arranging fabric samples across the kitchen island. She greeted me politely, but her expression changed the moment she realized why I had come. I did not raise my voice. I simply placed the bank statement and the property documents on the counter and asked one question. Tell me the truth. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face before pulling out a chair. He looked exhausted, but not surprised. That hurt more than anything. He had expected this moment. He admitted that he had used the financial access I had given him. He admitted that money had been transferred. He admitted that the house had been sold. Yet every sentence began with the same explanation. He kept saying he had done it for our future. I asked him what future could possibly require taking everything his mother owned without asking her. He said wedding costs had grown far beyond what he expected. Lauren had always dreamed of a beautiful ceremony with all their friends and family present. The venue required larger deposits. Vendors wanted payment in advance. They had already committed to contracts they could not afford to cancel. He insisted he believed the house would eventually become his inheritance anyway, so using its value now instead of years later seemed practical. I stared at him, wondering whether I was listening to my own son or a complete stranger. Daniel and I had worked overtime, skipped vacations, and sacrificed countless little luxuries to pay off that mortgage. Every dollar represented years of effort. Ethan had reduced all of those memories to a financial shortcut. Lauren finally spoke. She said she had assumed everything had been discussed within the family. She claimed Ethan told her I wanted to help because I believed this wedding was important. I looked directly at her and asked one simple question. Did you ever hear me say those words? She lowered her eyes and quietly admitted that she had not. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Ethan tried to reassure me by saying they planned to take care of me later. He promised I would never struggle. He promised they would make everything right after the wedding. I realized then that he truly believed promises about tomorrow could erase choices made yesterday. As I gathered my papers and stood to leave, I told him something my late husband used to say whenever life presented an easy shortcut. The fastest road is not always the right one. Ethan did not answer. He simply watched me walk out the front door, and for the first time since becoming his mother, I felt like I was leaving behind someone I no longer recognized. I spent that night in a modest hotel less than 5 miles from my old neighborhood because I could not bring myself to ask friends for help before I understood exactly what had happened. Sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel sitting at our kitchen table, balancing the family checkbook with the same careful attention he gave everything in life. He always believed that trust was the most valuable thing a family could own. By sunrise, I knew I could not rely on emotions alone. I needed facts. The next morning I met with an attorney named Rebecca Collins, a woman recommended by the bank manager. Her office was simple, with shelves full of legal books and framed photographs of her family. She listened without interrupting while I laid every document across her conference table. She did not rush me. She did not offer false comfort. When I finished, she quietly organized the paperwork into neat stacks and began asking careful questions. Had I ever intended to sell my home? No. Had I knowingly approved those financial transfers? No. Had anyone explained every document I had signed months earlier? Not completely. Rebecca nodded and made detailed notes. She explained that family disputes involving finances could become complicated because trust often replaced careful documentation. However, she also told me that complicated did not mean impossible. She wanted copies of every bank statement, every email, every text message, and every document connected to my property. Before leaving her office, I signed forms allowing her to request records on my behalf. For the first time since everything began, I felt a small sense of direction. Over the next several days, I gathered whatever information I could. Old filing cabinets stored at a neighbor's garage still contained tax records, insurance policies, and years of financial paperwork. Thankfully, I had given my closest friend, Susan, a spare box of important documents after Daniel passed away because I worried about losing them in a house fire. That decision now felt like one of the smartest choices I had ever made. As more records arrived, a timeline slowly emerged. Several financial transfers had occurred only days after Ethan helped me update my online banking. The paperwork connected to the property had been processed surprisingly quickly. Rebecca pointed out details that I never would have noticed on my own. Some signatures looked rushed compared to my normal handwriting. Certain documents had been submitted electronically without any record of an in-person meeting. None of those facts proved wrongdoing by themselves, but together they raised serious questions that deserved answers. Meanwhile, word began spreading through the family. My younger sister called first. She sounded uncomfortable and admitted Ethan had already spoken with several relatives. According to him, I had become confused after Daniel's death and could no longer manage my finances responsibly. Hearing those words nearly took my breath away. I had always paid my bills on time, filed my taxes, and handled every responsibility myself. Suddenly I was being described as someone who could not be trusted with her own decisions. A few relatives stopped returning my calls altogether. Others politely suggested I should forgive Ethan because families sometimes made difficult choices during stressful times. I realized that while I had been trying to understand the truth, another story had quietly been spreading ahead of me. Rebecca noticed the worry on my face during our next meeting. She closed the file in front of her and said something I would remember for the rest of my life. Margaret, facts do not become less true simply because someone tells a louder story. At that moment, I stopped worrying about defending my reputation and started focusing on uncovering every piece of the truth. The days that followed became a test of patience more than anything else. Every morning I woke up hoping for one honest phone call from Ethan, one conversation where he would finally admit that what he had done was wrong and ask how to fix it. Instead, my phone filled with messages from relatives who believed they were helping by encouraging me to let everything go. One cousin told me that weddings brought enormous pressure and that young people sometimes made poor financial decisions. An uncle reminded me that Ethan was my only child and that forgiveness mattered more than money. Even a longtime neighbor suggested that perhaps I should see this as giving my son an early inheritance. None of them understood that this had never been about the dollar amount. It was about choice. Daniel and I had always planned to help Ethan when we believed he truly needed it, but helping someone and having everything taken without permission were two completely different things. Rebecca continued gathering records while I tried to rebuild the timeline one piece at a time. Then something unexpected happened. Lauren called me late one afternoon. Her voice sounded nervous, and she asked if we could meet somewhere private. We agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop the following morning. When she arrived, she looked exhausted. She admitted that the closer the wedding became, the more uncomfortable she felt about everything surrounding the finances. She insisted she had believed Ethan when he told her I had willingly supported their plans. However, after our conversation at the townhouse, she started asking him questions he refused to answer directly. She confessed that whenever she mentioned the house or the missing money, Ethan changed the subject or insisted they would discuss it after the honeymoon. I thanked her for telling me the truth, but I also explained that honesty arriving late could not erase everything that had already happened. She nodded without arguing. Before we left, she quietly handed me copies of several emails related to wedding payments that Ethan had forwarded to her. She said she thought my attorney might find them useful. Rebecca certainly did. Those emails established dates that matched several of the largest withdrawals from my accounts. They also showed how quickly expensive deposits had been paid after those transactions. Although none of the documents alone answered every legal question, together they painted a much clearer picture of the sequence of events. Meanwhile, Ethan became increasingly frustrated that I had hired an attorney. He finally called me one evening and accused me of embarrassing the family. He said people were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions and that Lauren seemed distant ever since meeting with me. I calmly told him that the truth often became uncomfortable before it became clear. He responded by saying I was choosing strangers over my own son. I reminded him that I had not chosen any of this. He ended the call without saying goodbye. After I placed the phone on the table, I realized something important had changed inside me. The fear that had consumed me since standing outside my own house was beginning to disappear. In its place was determination. I was no longer chasing apologies or hoping someone would suddenly make the right decision. I was following the facts wherever they led, even if they revealed truths that would permanently change. My family. Rebecca called me the very next morning with a calm but unmistakably serious tone in her voice. She said several newly obtained records had answered questions we had been asking from the beginning, and after reviewing them, she believed the entire situation was about to take a very different direction. When I arrived at Rebecca Collins's office that morning, she already had several folders spread across the conference table. Unlike our previous meetings, she did not begin by asking questions. Instead, she slid a stack of documents toward me and calmly explained that the records she had received filled in several missing pieces of the timeline. The property transaction had moved much faster than either of us expected because many of the documents had been submitted electronically within a very short period. Even more important, the records showed inconsistencies that required closer examination. Rebecca carefully pointed to dates, signatures, and authorization forms, explaining each detail in plain language so I could follow everything without feeling overwhelmed. She reminded me that it would ultimately be up to the appropriate parties to determine the legal significance of those inconsistencies, but she also said they were serious enough that they should not be ignored. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt as though the truth was no longer slipping through my fingers. It was beginning to take shape on paper. Over the next several days, Rebecca contacted the professionals involved in the property sale and requested additional documentation. Some responded quickly and cooperatively. Others became noticeably more cautious once they realized questions were being asked. One representative admitted that almost all communication had come through Ethan rather than directly through me. Another confirmed that certain assumptions had been made because paperwork appeared complete when it was submitted. No one openly accused anyone else of wrongdoing, but it became obvious that important decisions had been made without anyone ever speaking to me personally. That fact alone left me wondering how such a life-changing transaction could move forward without a single conversation with the person who had lived in that house for nearly 40 years. Then another unexpected phone call arrived. It was Lauren. Her voice sounded steadier than it had during our last meeting. She told me she had confronted Ethan again after discovering more financial documents at their townhouse. This time, instead of reassuring her, he became defensive and insisted everyone was overreacting. According to Lauren, he kept repeating that everything would work out once the wedding was over and that I would eventually forgive him because I was his mother. She admitted that hearing him say those words frightened her more than any legal paperwork because it convinced her he still did not understand the seriousness of what had happened. She quietly apologized for believing his version of events without ever asking me directly. I accepted her apology, not because it erased the past, but because it was sincere. Later that afternoon, Rebecca called with another update. Several additional financial records had arrived, creating an even clearer picture of how money had moved over the previous 2 months. The sequence matched many of the wedding expenses almost exactly. Again, she reminded me that documentation alone did not answer every legal question, but it significantly strengthened our understanding of the timeline. As she organized the files back into neat folders, she looked at me with quiet confidence and said, "Margaret, people can disagree about memories, conversations, and intentions. Documents are different. They tell a story that is much harder to change." Driving away from her office, I realized something had shifted beyond the paperwork. For weeks, I had felt like someone desperately trying to prove that my own life had happened the way I remembered it. Now I no longer felt alone in that effort. The facts were beginning to speak for themselves, and before long, everyone who had accepted the easier story would have to decide whether they were willing to face the harder truth. Less than a week before the wedding, Rebecca called and asked whether I would be willing to attend one final meeting before any additional formal steps were taken. She explained that everyone involved had agreed to sit down together with their attorneys present to review the documentation that had been collected. I agreed because I no longer wanted assumptions or family gossip to speak for me. I wanted the facts to stand on their own. The meeting took place in a quiet conference room with a long wooden table. Ethan arrived looking tired, and Lauren followed a few moments later. She offered me a small, hesitant smile that I returned. Across the table, Rebecca calmly arranged the folders in chronological order. There were no dramatic speeches, no raised voices, and no emotional accusations. She simply walked everyone through the timeline one document at a time. First came the authorization forms that Ethan had asked me to sign months earlier. Then came the banking records showing the sequence of transfers. Next were the emails confirming wedding payments that closely followed those transactions. Finally came the property records, each placed beside the next until the entire series of events could be seen without interruption. As the documents accumulated across the table, the room grew quieter. Several questions were directed toward Ethan. At first he repeated the same explanations I had already heard. He insisted he believed he was acting in the family's best interest. He said he expected everything would eventually belong to him anyway and that he had planned to make things right after the wedding. But as more records were reviewed, those explanations became shorter. He stopped trying to justify every decision and instead admitted that he had convinced himself he would solve the problems later. Rebecca gently pointed out that good intentions, even if genuine, did not replace clear permission or informed consent. Lauren sat silently for most of the meeting. Then she quietly spoke. She said she had never wanted a wedding that cost someone else their peace of mind. She admitted she should have asked more questions instead of accepting convenient answers. Hearing those words seemed to affect Ethan more than anything else that had been discussed. For the first time since this nightmare began, he looked directly at me instead of at the paperwork. His voice was softer than I had heard in weeks. He admitted that every time he crossed another line, he convinced himself it was only temporary. He believed that once the celebration was over, everyone would be happy enough that the details would no longer matter. Instead, every decision had pushed him farther away from the people he wanted to impress. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I told him I appreciated hearing the truth at last, but honesty arriving after trust had been broken could not erase the consequences. Trust was built one decision at a time, and unfortunately it could also disappear the same way. No one argued with that. By the end of the meeting, it was clear to everyone that the story circulating through our family had never matched the documented timeline. Relatives who had quietly supported Ethan began reaching out after learning more about what had actually happened. Some apologized for judging me too quickly. Others admitted they had accepted only one side because it seemed easier. As I walked out of that conference room beside Rebecca, I realized I no longer felt the need to convince anyone of my version of events. The truth had finally reached the people who mattered, and whatever came next would be built on facts instead of assumptions. The weeks after the meeting were not easy, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like my life was moving forward instead of falling apart. The legal process continued quietly behind the scenes. Rebecca handled the conversations, reviewed additional paperwork, and made sure every decision was based on facts rather than emotions. I learned that restoring what had been lost was not always as simple as correcting a mistake. Some things could be addressed through legal steps, but other things required time and patience. My home on Maple Ridge Drive remained at the center of the process, and every update brought a mixture of relief and sadness. I had spent so many years believing that house would always be the place where my family gathered. Now it represented a painful lesson about trust and responsibility. Ethan reached out several times during that period. At first, his messages were short and uncertain. He asked how I was doing and whether there was anything he could do. I appreciated that he was finally trying to communicate, but I also knew that rebuilding our relationship would require more than a few conversations. One evening, he asked if we could meet at a small park where Daniel and I used to walk on weekends. I agreed because I wanted to hear what he had to say. Ethan arrived carrying a folder filled with documents and notes. He told me he had spent weeks thinking about every choice he had made. He admitted that he had become so focused on creating the wedding he imagined that he stopped seeing the person who had supported him his entire life. He said he confused my love for unlimited permission, and he finally understood the difference. I listened carefully because those were the words I had hoped to hear from him from the beginning. But I also told him that understanding the mistake was only the first step. A relationship damaged by broken trust could not be repaired overnight. It would require consistency, honesty, and respect moving forward. He nodded and accepted that. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no instant solution, and no simple ending. There was only a difficult conversation between a mother and son who both realized how much had changed. Around the same time, some family members began treating me differently. My sister Susan apologized for doubting me. She admitted that she had been influenced by the version of events she heard first and that she should have asked me directly. Several relatives who had encouraged me to forgive quickly later admitted they had not understood the full situation. Their apologies meant something, but I also learned that forgiveness did not mean pretending nothing happened. It meant choosing peace without ignoring reality. Eventually, the legal matters reached a resolution that allowed me to focus on rebuilding my life. I returned to my neighborhood with a different perspective. The house was still filled with memories of Daniel, but I realized the most important parts of my life were not stored inside those walls. They existed in the lessons I carried, the people who stood beside me, and the strength I discovered when everything I depended on was challenged. I had lost the certainty that family always meant safety, but I gained something equally valuable. I learned that protecting yourself and loving your family could exist at the same time. Several months have passed since the day I stood outside my own home and discovered that my life had changed without my knowledge. When I look back now, I realize the hardest part was never the paperwork, the meetings, or the uncertainty. The hardest part was accepting that someone I loved could make choices that caused so much pain while believing they were doing the right thing. That lesson changed me, but it did not define me. I still wake up every morning grateful for the simple things I once took for granted. I enjoy my coffee on the back porch, I spend time with friends who stood beside me, and I continue creating memories in a home that means more to me than ever before. The house on Maple Ridge Drive is no longer just a place where my past happened. It has become a reminder that I survived a difficult chapter and found my way forward. My relationship with Ethan is different now. Some days are easier than others. We do not pretend that everything can return to the way it was before. Trust is not repaired by saying the perfect words. It is rebuilt through actions repeated over time. Ethan has made an effort to be more honest and responsible, and I have learned to appreciate those efforts while still protecting the boundaries I need. I love my son, but I also understand that love does not require me to ignore my own well-being. That was one of the most important lessons I learned. For many years, I believed being a good mother meant always saying yes, always helping, and always putting my family first. I now understand that supporting the people you love also includes teaching them that choices have consequences. A family becomes stronger through honesty, not through avoiding difficult conversations. Lauren and I occasionally exchange messages. She and Ethan eventually made their own decisions about their future, and while our paths are not as closely connected as we once imagined, I appreciate that she eventually chose honesty when it mattered. I do not hold on to anger because anger keeps you tied to the moment that hurt you. Instead, I choose to remember the lessons that came from it. I learned to ask questions. I learned to read documents carefully. I learned that kindness and caution can exist together. Most importantly, I learned that my value was never determined by what I owned or what someone else could take away. Daniel used to tell me that a person's character was revealed during difficult seasons, not easy ones. I finally understand what he meant. When everything felt uncertain, I discovered who truly supported me, and I discovered strength I never knew I had. If there is one thing I hope people remember from my experience, it is this: love your family, but do not lose yourself in the process. Trust is precious, and it should always be protected. The people closest to us can bring us the greatest happiness, but they can also teach us the most important lessons. Today, when I stand in my home and look around at the memories that fill each room, I no longer see what was almost lost. I see what I found. I found my voice, my confidence, and the understanding that a new beginning can come from even the most unexpected moments.